At 50, the desk feels heavier than ever. At 24, the night feels perfect for more work. At 50, tired eyes stare at another screen. At 24, the phone never stops buzzing. At 50, silence in the office feels overwhelming. At 24, multitasking feels like ambition. At 50, meetings feel exhausting. At 24, saying yes to everything feels like opportunity. At 50, even the car ride home feels draining. At 24, lunch breaks feel unnecessary. At 50, sleep becomes difficult to find. At 24, emails can always wait until midnight. At 50, the pile of work feels endless. At 24, doing everything at once feels productive. At 50, sitting quietly becomes rare. At 24, overtime feels like dedication. At 50, the city lights look different through tired eyes. At 24, late nights feel normal. At 50, mornings begin with exhaustion. At 24, the phone is the first thing you check. At 50, burnout becomes a real conversation. At 24, mental health feels like a distant idea. At 50, tension lives in every meeting. At 24, another meeting feels like progress. At 50, the office feels lonely. At 24, work calls interrupt everything. At 50, the laptop feels heavier every night. At 24, every project feels like a chance to prove yourself. At 50, the train ride feels endless. At 24, staying late feels necessary. At 50, coffee becomes survival. At 24, caffeine replaces rest. At 50, even quiet parks feel tense. At 24, rest feels like wasted time. At 50, the mind struggles to slow down. At 24, notifications never stop. At 50, stress follows you to your desk. At 24, juggling everything feels impressive. At 50, presentations feel heavier than before. At 24, preparing all night feels normal. At 50, the office grows darker at night. At 24, overtime becomes routine. At 50, numbers on reports feel overwhelming. At 24, the future feels like constant pressure. At 50, even phone calls bring tension. At 24, work conversations never stop. At 50, the chair becomes a place of exhaustion. At 24, weekends disappear into work. At 50, the screen glows late into the night. At 24, deadlines feel endless. At 50, exhaustion quietly builds. At 24, breaks feel unnecessary. At 50, the office grows silent. At 24, personal life slowly fades. At 50, hallways feel empty. At 24, emails feel urgent every hour. At 50, even coffee tastes bitter. At 24, caffeine keeps the pace going. At 50, the laptop screen feels endless. At 24, projects fill every night. At 50, work becomes overwhelming. At 24, balance feels unnecessary. At 50, the reports feel heavier. At 24, pushing harder feels like success. At 50, tension fills every meeting. At 24, meetings stack one after another. At 50, the commute feels exhausting. At 24, staying late becomes a habit. At 50, the window shows a tired reflection. At 24, deadlines control every day. At 50, stress finally demands attention. At 24, warning signs are ignored. At 50, the pressure becomes visible. At 24, responsibilities keep piling up. At 50, the office stays quiet late at night. At 24, work follows you home. At 50, burnout becomes reality. At 24, sleep feels optional. At 50, paperwork feels overwhelming. At 24, pressure feels normal. At 50, coffee breaks become moments of survival. At 24, productivity replaces rest. At 50, reflection becomes unavoidable. At 24, worry about the future never stops. At 50, the body finally feels the pressure. At 24, exhaustion is ignored. At 50, the office lamp glows in the silence. At 24, work never truly ends. At 50, the mind feels overwhelmed. At 24, pressure becomes routine. At 50, quiet rooms invite reflection. At 24, breaks are never taken. At 50, evenings feel empty. At 24, work stress comes home. At 50, burnout finally shows itself. At 24, hobbies disappear. At 50, exhaustion sits quietly at the desk. At 24, productivity never slows.